Well, ladies and gentlemen, actually quite a lot to talk about today. But before we do actually get onto the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help. So let's actually get on to the main video of today. And the first topic that we need to talk about is the PI Act. Now, if you don't know what the PI Act is, you would be forgiven, because it's actually an act that was enacted in 1998 to give effect to Section 26.3 of the Constitution. Now, the Act actually stands for the Prevention of Illegal Eviction from and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act. Now, the purpose of the Act is to ensure that no one can be evicted from their home without a court order, and the evictions must be just and equitable, especially for vulnerable individuals like the elderly, women, children, or disabled. Now, the Act itself was designed to protect the rights of people living in informal housing or occupied land, basically attempting to balance between human dignity and property rights in a post-apartheid South Africa. Now, the Act itself was designed to protect the vulnerable, but ultimately has placed significant burdens on landowners and municipalities. Any evictions that are unlawful have to go to the court. They require 14 days notice. And you, as the municipality or the evictee, have to consider alternative accommodation and weigh both sides of hardships. That's the hardships to the individual having to lead and the hardships that you have to do in order to rehouse them. And over time, it's not only been used by destitute individuals, but it's also been exploited by syndicates and some political actors to delay lawful development. Now, obviously, when it comes through to political actors, we can think of the EFF, who basically says, occupy some land, and then it's very difficult to remove people. So the Act itself has come back into the public fray. Now, it's been outside of the public fray for some time, but now people are starting to talk about it. And you've got to ask yourself the question as to why people are starting to talk about it. And actually, the answer to that is actually a hell of a lot easier to understand than you might think. And it actually comes down to land invasions. Now, land invasions are on the rise, especially in Cape Town, Durban, and Gauteng, mainly driven by poverty, housing shortages, and unemployment. We all know this to be true. However, it's a little bit more insidious than that, and that is because since the passing of the Expropriation Act, there seems to be this mistaken idea that basically you can just occupy land now. You can just expropriate it. And so what we've actually seen is that in a number of cases, such as the City of Cape Town versus Hussein and various other cases, the actual act itself has stalled the use of land, frustrated property owners who have attempted to exert their property rights, and ultimately has reinforced delays which have been caused by the PI process. So we've actually got actual examples of where the PI Act is causing actual harm to cities. Now, the DA in May 2025 issued an amendment bill to Parliament, which I must be honest to say actually hasn't made the media rounds. And why it hasn't made the media rounds, well, I don't know. But the actual amendment bill aims to criminalize inciting land occupations, tighten emergency housing duties for municipalities, and clarify the limits and the timelines for the obligations under PI. Basically, the idea behind it is to say that actually municipalities are overwhelmed, they're failing to provide alternative housing, which legally blocks evictions, and as a result, property rights versus housing rights, private investment versus any forms of social justice, all of that is becoming tense. Because what you have on the one side is you have the EFF and the ANC's hard left, all trying to defend the PI Act, and they're trying to call for examples of expropriation without compensation, making PI a battleground for the whole idea of land reform. They're trying to use it as their weapon. And then you have cities like Cape Town who are trying to build in various areas and are being frustrated through the legal process. So the idea behind the DA's amendment bill is to basically re-exert some form of property rights in South Africa. And one has to ask the question as to why this has not been promoted in the media. I mean, here we are in July, and I've got to say I haven't really seen any articles around this. So do let me know what you think about that in the comments section below. So let's actually move then on to the next story. And this is the Minister of Police controversy, because as you all know, the Lieutenant General of KZN exposed a criminal syndicate in INSAPs involving the police, judiciary, and politicians. And the idea there was that the Minister of Police and the Deputy Commissioner were supposedly sabotaging political killings investigations. And he claimed that there were 120 case dockets which were removed under his orders, which stopped the whole political killings investigations basically from proceeding. Now, a tenderpreneur linked to a 360 million SAPS contract is currently in prison and is allegedly being bankrolled by the Minister of Police. And he was caught with a cell phone in his cell, which is illegal. Now, he's been accused of arranging a hit on his influencer girlfriend and supposedly has links to a weapons cache found in a various house. Now, the minister has denied all forms of knowledge to these criminal syndicates. There's this figure of the cat who is an example of where the minister supposedly is getting involved in forms of criminal syndicates, this SAPS contract, this tenderpreneur. And the minister in typical fashion says, well, he doesn't know anything about it. So we now have the Lieutenant General's allegations, and we actually have an actual example outside of that where there does appear to be a link with a criminal syndicate. And the Minister of Police actually says that he admits that that tender that we just drew reference to needs to be reviewed, and apparently the tender should be terminated. Now, the Speaker of Parliament is considering a parliamentary debate, and the President is expected to address the scandal when he gets back from the whole BRICS summit. But in typical fashion, the Minister of Police he said he's calling for some form of accountability. He suggests that the ANC won't defend any wrongdoing, but there is actually a lot of questions at the moment. You can see the way that the rhetoric is already going. And basically what's happening is you can already see they're talking about bumping off the Lieutenant General, because as we know, the ANC always supports their own. You had this Lieutenant General, sound the warning signals. He made the original allegations. We now have a secondary example in the form of this key figure. Supposedly, there's a hell of a lot more to these to come out the woodwork, so some of which have actually even involved the previous Minister of Police, Becky Seller. So one would argue that there's no smoke without fire, and so we can expect to see the normal. But in my personal opinion, I can see the Minister of Police being protected because that's just the ANC way. So let's move on to the third news article of today, and this is actually around the US trade war. As you will know, South Africa is due to get Trump's big, beautiful tariffs. That's 30% effective on the 1st of August 2025. This will target South Africa's goods, specifically the exports relating to tires, components, agricultural goods, and these have all been justified by Trump in the balance of an unfair trade imbalance. Now, some experts are saying that these figures are inaccurate and the tariffs will devastate South Africa's industries as a whole. And what we can take from that is that AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which previously allowed up to 6,000 products duty-free into the US, well, that's done. That's finished. And the tariffs will likely mark an end to any form of preferential access into the United States. So what is this actually meaning for South Africa? What industries are under threat? Well, we look at citrus, nuts, wine exports. They're going to all be significantly reduced or at risk. We got local retailers cutting back on production and reducing work hours. So that's job losses that are going to occur. And ultimately, we can see a number of small businesses that rely on providing those goods and services to the US. Well, they're going to go under. Now, in response to this, John Steenhuisen has called for an urgent negotiation and a reform to preserve trade ties. Now, that's because John's trying to preserve jobs. And according to Ramaphosa, well, he pledges to explore new markets and to protect jobs like that. But you see, the problem is that most analysts suggest that trying to pivot to somewhere like, say, China would require an industrial policy reform, and forming new trade relations and actual routes to market in other countries, well, that's not a quick fix. And anybody who's ever worked in business knows that. When you lose a contract, attempting to find a new buyer for your goods is a very lengthy process, because the ability to replace the buyer of size is very, very difficult. if you sell to macro and macro pull your product, and now you're going to sell to like the local corner shop, well, that guy's not going to buy anywhere as near the same quantities as say macro. I mean, this is business 101. And so the biggest problem that you inevitably have is, given the timescales, the cash flow demands, and the logistical life cycle of actually getting products to market, well, the problem is that the delay is going to cause businesses to go under. And that should be obvious. All of us in business, we know that. You may suffer an actual cash flow problem for a period whilst you're trying to do that. Then you've got a new buyer, but they only buy half your stock. So now you've got wages, you've got bills to pay. If your product is perishable, it goes off. Like, these are all problems you have. And so you can't just say, well, we'll just pivot to new markets. That's only a retard would say that, because once a business goes under, cash flow is exhausted, the product goes off. It's very difficult to restart those up. I know that ANC tends to think you can crash an economy and just restart it tomorrow, but that's actually not the way it works in reality. In fact, if you actually look at emerging markets, South Africa's emerging market is the only emerging market that did not restart itself after the COVID-19 lockdowns. And so to assume that somehow we'll just restart ourselves after losing jobs and businesses at the end of a go is the daftest thing possible. But I mean, these are communists who have never worked a day in their life, so maybe they don't understand that. In any case, the US Treasury Secretary has skipped the G20 in Durban the second time in 2025, signaling diplomatic frost. So basically, he's saying he's snubbing South Africa because, well, he says that there's nothing to be done here. He says, who wants to do business there anyway? And the Secretary of State in the US has also snubbed South Africa, with tensions over land expropriation and BRICS alignment growing. And so you have to ask yourself, well, you've got to renegotiate these brand new trade agreements, but nobody wants to talk to you in the US because diplomatically everything's frosty. So what does that actually mean? Does that mean that we're going to negotiate a new act? Yeah, I don't think so. No, personally, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen. So let's actually move then on to the next topic of today. And this is actually around the tobacco industry. Now, you might not actually think that this is an important topic, but actually it is, because let me explain. According to a new study, illegal cigarettes dominate 77% of cigarettes sold in South Africa. These cigarettes are sold below the legal minimum tax price of 26 Rand per pack. And the problem is that this black market, if you want to call it that, and that's not black farmers, that's a black market, is actually a growth sector. And it's really, really big growth sector. Now, you see, the result of this is that actual black tobacco farmers are being wiped out. Now, remember, these are black tobacco farmers that were all supported through BEE initiatives. Now, according to the latest studies, there are only 10 black tobacco farmers left because the rest of them are all getting wiped out. Now, you see, in many instances, these black farmers have actually had to switch their crop from tobacco to vegetables, or they've just left agriculture. And so what we're actually seeing is that the black participation in the tobacco industry has drastically shrunk due to illegal cigarettes. Now, it's been suggested that the market had already shrunk 40% post-COVID, and this has led to an estimated 35,000 jobs lost, with more currently under threat across the value chain, all because of illegal cigarettes. So what does this actually show you? Well, what it actually shows you is that because the government is unable to crack down on any form of illegal trade, they have been unable to yet again protect rural jobs and any form of economic viability for these black emerging farmers. And so we have to take stories like this into account when we hear all the rhetoric around BEE and black participation in the economy, because it's the ANC itself and its own inability to govern that has actually wiped out emerging farmers in an area which theoretically should actually be very easy for them to do very well in, tobacco. In any case, let's move us on to the very last news article of today. And to be honest, this is actually linked to a video I did the other day, or specifically around the Standard Bank CEO and his support of BEE. Because it has now emerged that Standard Bank has, and you know, I say this time and time again, if you read the news enough, you start to link articles. And after a period, you actually start to notice the patterns. And here we actually have a pattern emerging, because Standard Bank has 272 billion rand exposed to South Africa's sovereign debt. That's 13% of its total assets. Now, the bank's credit profile is now very interlinked with the state, making it vulnerable to any form of state fiscal instability. And a lot of states' fiscal instability and the way the ANC funds itself is through tenderpreneurship. So does it surprise anybody that the individual sat there on a platform basically say, B's great. I mean, South Africa's overregulated, but B's great. Well, with this bombshell news, the answer should be, well, no, because as I said in that video the other day, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Ultimately, what we are seeing with the bank is that since 2019, foreigners have reduced their bonds holdings with domestic funds filling the gap. And so what we're seeing is that where foreigners would previously have owned bonds, they don't want to buy bonds in South Africa anymore. The domestic funds that are now filling them have come from places like Standard Bank. So that's a serious amount of exposure with the state. So Standard Bank itself actually remains vulnerable to any form of systemic risk to government debt. Any form of government debt, any form of risk to that actually threatens to cause havoc to the actual financial institution of Standard Bank. So with that being said, why wouldn't they vote for BE? I mean, it's basically integral in the bank's survival at this point in time. Anyway, these are the news stories of today. Do let me know what you think about everything in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.
You know, critics of the Israeli government will say that there's a lot of innocent people in Gaza who don't worship Geth, who have been killed in airstrikes. And how do you sort of square that?
Well, if I may say so, most of the criticism in the Western media and from, let's say, many politicians is there's been too many innocent deaths in Gaza and it's got to stop. Okay. I always have a challenge to these people, which I simply say to them, fine, tell me how you would achieve the following. Let's say we're in New York. Let's say that New Jersey fires rockets for years. Let's say that for 18 years, the government there has used all money coming in to enrich themselves and to build a vast tunnel network in which they can store munitions and hostages and much more. And let's say that right next door to where you're living, this very densely well-built up terrorist infrastructure invaded you, killed hundreds and hundreds of your people, took 250 more hostage. Tell me how you would operate in that terrain to ensure that you kill or capture all the leaders of the people who did this and wipe out their ability to ever rule that entity again. And secondly, how you get back 250 hostages. And I have yet to hear a critic of the Israeli government's actions give me a viable plan for how you would get back the hostages. And there are still several dozen hostages in captivity, some living, and how you would punish and kill the people who did that. Because just again, if you extrapolate out the population of Israel, about 9 million, to a population the size of the United States, this was equivalent on October the 7th to some 44,000 Americans being killed in one day and another 10,000 Americans being taken hostage. As for the ideology, I have yet to be persuaded that there is something so extraordinary about Hamas as a force that their ideology can never be wiped out. We have seen many death cult ideologies in history.
The ones you mentioned.
The ones I mentioned.
Century.
Well, let's just take one that, let's take Imperial Japan. You would have found people who say there's nothing we can do to wipe that out. I do not believe there is something so unique about Hamas that among all the death cults we've seen throughout history, this one is uniquely virile.